There's a specific kind of silence that happens around a birthday. Not the celebration itself, the night before, or the morning of, or the drive home afterward. The moment when the noise stops and something automatic starts. A kind of inventory, a quiet scan through the list of things that were supposed to have happened by now, and a comparison running fast between that list and what actually has. It happens at 30. It happens harder at 35. For some people, it happens at 28. For others, it's 42, and they still can't name exactly what they're measuring themselves against, or when they agreed to be measured by it. They just know the answer. Behind. You felt it, even if you've never said it out loud. Not behind anything specific, behind a schedule that lives in you but didn't come from you. And here's what this video is going to give you, clearly, before we go any further. By the end of this, you will be able to see that timeline, where it actually came from, how it installed itself, why it cannot be satisfied, and what it has been quietly costing you in the years you've spent measuring yourself against it. That clarity won't erase the timeline, but it will change your relationship to the verdict it keeps delivering. And for most people, that shift is the one that was missing.
The first thing to say is that the timeline feels true. Not true like a conscious belief you could defend in an argument. True the way physical sensations are true. The tightening in the chest when something arrives later than the schedule said it should. The particular flatness that settles in after achieving something that was supposed to feel like arrival and instead feels like what's next and when. The way certain announcements from certain people, engagements, promotions, houses, children, produce a response in you that you couldn't quite map onto an emotion if you tried. Not jealousy, something quieter, something that feels like the timeline clearing its throat. You're not imagining this. The timeline is real. You carry it. It runs comparisons. It produces verdicts. And it has been doing this, on some level, for most of your adult life. You've also probably noticed that satisfying it, reaching the things it marks as milestones, doesn't work the way it should. The milestone arrives, there is a moment of something, and then the timeline recalibrates, produces the next marker, and the sensation of behind reasserts itself with very little delay. That pattern, the milestone that doesn't land, the satisfaction that doesn't stay, the schedule that is never quite met even when it is met, that is not a personal failing. It is the predictable behavior of a mechanism that was built from the start to run on something other than your actual life. Here is a question almost nobody asks directly. Where did the timeline come from? Not rhetorically, specifically. Who wrote it? When? For what kind of person, in what kind of life, with what set of circumstances in mind? Because you didn't sit down at any point and construct it. You didn't reason your way to the conclusion that 30 was the correct age for one thing, or 34 for another, or that a certain sequence of financial and personal milestones constitutes a life correctly lived. Those conclusions arrived pre-formed, installed during a period of observation, childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, when you were watching what adult life looked like without yet being able to evaluate what you were watching or ask whose template you were absorbing. Some of it came from parents, their timeline, conscious or not, the age at which they reached things, the pride or disappointment associated with early or late arrival at milestones, the unspoken sense of what a life in good order looks like at each stage. Some of it came from culture, films, television, the shape of a story about a successful person, the way a protagonist is 30-something when they arrive, 40-something when they consolidate, and the decade in between is the crisis that gets resolved. Some of it came from peers,
accumulated in the observational years of your 20s when everyone around you was also moving and the relative pace became data. None of these sources consulted you. None of them knew what kind of person you specifically were, what your actual capacities and timing and circumstances would be. None of them knew what decade you'd actually inhabit, what economy, what set of possibilities and constraints. They produced a generalized schedule, assembled from fragments of other people's lives, other people's eras, stories written for archetypes rather than individuals, and you absorbed it as though it were a factual account of how your life was supposed to go. The timeline was never a description of your life. It was a composite of other people's. The mechanism is simple and it is relentless, and it has one defining feature that makes it almost impossible to escape from inside. It cannot be satisfied by the thing it's measuring. Here is the loop. The timeline contains a set of markers, age-linked, sequential, representing states of arrival that the absorbed schedule designates as correct. The brain, running its habitual comparison, checks current location against the nearest marker. If the marker's been reached, it briefly registers. Then the schedule advances. The next marker appears. The comparison restarts. If the marker has not been reached, the response is urgency, a low-grade pressure that influences decisions, sometimes productively, often not. What the loop cannot do is update the schedule based on actual information about you. The schedule doesn't know that you spent 3 years doing something that didn't work and learned something real from it. It doesn't account for the year that was genuinely impossible, the illness, the loss, the restructuring, the thing that consumed the capacity the schedule assumed was available. It doesn't register that the path you took, which diverged from the template at a specific point, was the right path, not because it was painless, but because it was yours. The schedule absorbed no information about the specific shape of your life. It can't. It was set before your life had a shape. So the verdicts keep coming, on time, ahead, behind, always in reference to a clock that was calibrated somewhere else for someone else in a moment that has nothing to do with where you actually are. The particular cruelty of the time-based mechanism compared to other ways financial and life anxiety operate is that it forecloses the present. It is always about when things arrive, when they should have arrived, when the next thing needs to happen. This orientation is so constant that the present moment where the actual life is occurring becomes difficult to inhabit. It is always a waypoint, a transit corridor between the last thing the schedule marked and the next thing it requires. You didn't fall behind, you kept getting graded on someone else's exam. And the exam has no final paper. There is no point at which you sit down and the timeline says, finished, adequate, no more assessment required. It produces markers until the markers run out. And then, in the lives of people who have run this pattern long enough, it produces a different and quieter question. A question about what was missed in the years spent trying to stay on schedule. That question is not yet. For most people in the middle of the pattern, the schedule still has markers ahead, but it is the question the pattern is building toward. This is what smart money sabotage is here to name, not the obvious financial decisions, but the invisible architecture underneath them, the timelines, the comparisons, the inherited measures of adequacy that shape how intelligent people experience the lives they are actually building.
This lives in very ordinary moments. Most of them don't look like anything from the outside. There's the person who got the promotion they worked toward for 2 years. The day it came through was good. They told the people who mattered. There was dinner, there was a real feeling of something. By the following week, the timeline had already produced the next question. What's the one after this, and how long until it arrives? Not because they're greedy or incapable of satisfaction, because the mechanism moved before the satisfaction had time to settle. The promotion was a marker, It was reached, the schedule advanced, the next comparison began. There's the person who receives a wedding invitation from someone a few years younger than them and feels something they can't immediately categorize. Not jealousy, they genuinely want good things for this person, but something, a faint internal signal. The timeline noting that someone on a slightly accelerated schedule just hit a marker, the comparison running automatically. No decision was made, no feeling was chosen, the mechanism simply ran. There's the person who made a deliberate choice to take a different kind of path, to start something of their own, to leave something that wasn't working, to spend a few years oriented differently than the standard sequence would suggest. And intellectually, they stand behind it. The reasoning is sound, the decision, revisited, holds up. But around certain ages, certain birthdays, certain accumulations of announcements from people still on the conventional track, something runs. A question that doesn't quite become words, but has the structure of, was I wrong? Not about the decision, about the timing, whether the gap it opened in the schedule will close in time. And then there is the version that is the hardest to say out loud. The person who is, by almost any external measure, doing well, income, stability, relationships, a life that is genuinely being built, and who sits down sometimes, alone usually, late at night or early in the morning, and runs a version of the calculation they have run many times, not of finances, of life, where they are, what the schedule says they should be, how far the gap is, and whether there is still time. Not to fix anything, just to recalculate, to check whether the timeline is still theoretically closable. That calculation never produces peace. The structure of it cannot produce peace. The question is built in a way that the answer is always not yet, not quite, one more thing and then maybe. If you've run that calculation, the late-night version, where you're measuring where you are against where the schedule says you should be, leave a comment. Not what the numbers said, just have you run it? The number of people doing the same calculation alone is something worth making visible. Every time you feel behind, ask yourself whose schedule this is, because it was never yours to begin with.
The cost of living inside an inherited timeline is not one consequence. It is a texture, a quality that spreads across the whole surface of a life. The most immediate cost is in decisions. When urgency is generated by a schedule rather than by actual circumstances, decisions get made at the wrong speed for the wrong reasons. Relationships entered because the timeline said it was time. Financial commitments made to acquire the markers the schedule required, the house, the car, the outward shape of having arrived before the internal situation was actually ready. Career moves driven by the sense that the window was narrowing rather than by a genuine reading of what the next right thing was. The timeline creates a pace. The pace overrides the pace that the actual life, in its actual conditions, would naturally set. And decisions made at the timeline's pace rather than the life's pace tend to require correction. That correction costs something: money, time, sometimes years. There's a book that addresses this more carefully than most, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. The title refers to the approximate number of weeks in a human life. One of its central arguments is that the anxiety most people feel about time is not actually about running out of it. It's about the impossible demand that time be managed well enough to accomplish everything the schedule requires. The anxiety is generated not by the finiteness of time, but by the gap between the schedule and the life. That gap, Berkman argues, cannot be closed by better time management. It can only be addressed by examining the schedule itself. The cost shows up in the relationships that form alongside the pattern. A partner who senses that milestones, when they arrive, don't quite land, that the celebration is always slightly partial, the presents slightly divided between now and the next thing the timeline requires.
Over years, the experience of never quite arriving together at anything produces a quiet distance that neither person can precisely name. It's not conflict, it's the gap between someone who is present and someone who is always slightly in the next stage of the schedule, managing the distance between now and then. The subtlest cost, and in many ways the one that accumulates most quietly, is the relationship with the present moment itself. A person running an inherited timeline is always in mild negotiation with the present. The present is adequate or inadequate depending on whether it matches the schedule. When it matches, the present is briefly inhabited. When it doesn't, which is most of the time because the schedule was not built for this specific life, the present is a problem to be corrected, a gap to be closed, a waypoint rather than a destination. The life that is actually happening is the one happening now. The timeline keeps pointing somewhere else.
Think about one thing in your life right now that you are experiencing as behind schedule. Something that is late, according to the internal clock. Something that should have happened earlier, or should be further along, or hasn't started yet when it should have. Now ask, whose schedule placed it there? When did you decide that this particular thing should have happened by this particular point? Was it a decision at all, or did it arrive, already timed, from somewhere you can't quite locate? Notice that you may not be able to answer that. Notice what it means that you've been measured against a clock you didn't set. There are things you have that you are not fully enjoying because they arrived later than the schedule said they should have. The lateness colors them. They don't feel the way they would have felt if they had arrived on time. There are things you achieved that felt incomplete the moment you achieved them, not because they weren't real, but because the timeline had already moved to the next marker before you could register the one you reached. You know someone, at least one person who is approximately your age and further along the conventional schedule than you are. You have checked. You may not call it checking, but you know. When you imagine being at peace with your life, the image that comes includes being on schedule. The peace and the schedule are connected. You haven't imagined a version of peace that doesn't involve closing the gap. You have made at least one significant decision, financial, relational, professional, that was accelerated by the sense that time on the schedule was narrowing. If you had felt no urgency about the timeline, you might have decided differently. The phrase, "it's not too late," produces something in you when you hear it. Relief, or the faint ache of needing to hear it, or a quick internal check against the schedule to assess whether it's true. Any of those responses confirm that too late is a category that is live and active in how you assess your life. You have not, at any point, consciously chosen this timeline. You could not fully reconstruct where it came from or who wrote it, and you have been living according to it, letting it assess you, allowing it to produce verdicts about your adequacy for as long as you can remember. None of these describe a failure of character. Every one of them describes a person who absorbed a measure of adequacy before they were old enough to evaluate it, and who has been carrying it unexamined ever since. The schedule is not an authority. It just arrived early enough to feel like one.
What changes when you can look at the timeline rather than through it? Not discard it. The timeline contains things that are genuinely yours, values about what a well-lived life involves, real aspirations toward things you actually want, an orientation toward the future that is part of how you engage with your own life. None of that dissolves. What becomes possible is the ability to separate those things from the parts of the schedule that were absorbed rather than chosen. To ask, for any given marker, did I decide this? Does this reflect something I actually want, for reasons I actually understand? Or is this a fragment from someone else's life that arrived in me before I could evaluate it?
That question is harder to sit with than it sounds, because some of the markers will hold up. Some of them, examined, will turn out to be genuinely yours, and some of them won't. Some of them will turn out to be traceable to a parent's life, to a film, to a period in your mid-20s when everyone around you was moving fast and the pace became the standard. Traceable and not yours. The ones that don't fold up don't need to be declared invalid and replaced. They just need to stop functioning as measures of adequacy. They were never qualified to do that job. They were measuring someone else's life against a schedule built for a different set of conditions and a different kind of person. The life you're postponing until you're on schedule is the one you're living right now. That is the reframe that the timeline makes almost structurally impossible to arrive at on its own. The mechanism is built to orient you away from the present, toward the gap, toward the next marker, toward the point at which the schedule will finally release you into something that feels like arrival. That point keeps moving. The schedule doesn't release. And the life, meanwhile, is not in the future. It is not in the gap. It is in the time that is happening now while the comparison runs. Oliver Burkeman writes about this, as does Bron Ware, whose research on what people regret at the end of their lives produced repeatedly a version of the same finding. Not that they had done the wrong things, but that they had spent so long becoming ready to live the life they wanted that the readiness itself became the thing they lived. Preparing to arrive, managing the schedule, and the life, fully inhabited, was always a little further ahead. Seeing this clearly is not the same as solving it. The timeline is in there. The comparisons will run. But there is a version of engagement with your own life that becomes possible once you can see the mechanism operating. A version that is less organized around closing the gap and more organized around what is actually present in the time that actually exists.
You have been carrying a clock that was set by other hands, in other times, for lives that were not yours. You have been letting it assess you, letting it deliver verdicts about your pace, your adequacy, whether the gap is still closable. The clock was not wrong to arrive. It was absorbed the way everything absorbed early is absorbed, without permission or evaluation, during the years when the brain was doing nothing but build its picture of how the world works. It came in, it installed itself, it has been running since. But a clock that was set somewhere else for someone else is not an authority on your life. It is just a clock. And there is one question worth returning to, slowly, without urgency, not as a problem to solve, but as something to genuinely sit with. What would you do with this year if no part of it had to catch you up? Not what you would stop doing, not what you would abandon, just if the schedule released its grip on this specific year, if behind was not a category available to you, if the time you are in right now was not a transit corridor, but the actual destination, what would you do with it? That question, taken seriously, has a different answer for almost everyone who asks it. And the answer is usually the one that was available the whole time.